In our feature segment today, Asian carp. No, these foreign fish aren't being sold in the U.S., but their introduction into the Mississippi River years ago is causing big problems now.
For almost 2 decades, Asian carp looked unstoppable. A fish brought here to solve one problem turned into a much bigger one. It overwhelmed U.S. rivers and rewrote entire ecosystems along the way. In some stretches of the Illinois River, carp made up most of the fish biomass, and every survey year after year told the same story: more carp than the year before. Then something odd happened. No new barrier went up, no major harvest push, nothing anyone could point to and say, "That's what did it." The numbers just started falling. Not a crash, a slow, steady slide. At first, scientists figured it was a data error. It wasn't. Something in the river had shifted, and for a while, nobody could say what. Why the carp were here in the first place. To see how strange this reversal really is, you have to go back to why Asian carp were brought here at all, and how completely they were expected to win once they got loose. Silver and bighead carp arrived in the southern U.S. in the early 1970s, imported by catfish farmers and wastewater operators who wanted something that would clear plankton and algae out of pond water fast. It worked. A little too well, as it turned out. Flooding over the next couple of decades gave the fish repeated chances to escape into the Mississippi system, and once they were loose, the same traits that made them useful in a farm pond made them nearly impossible to stop in open water. A single female bighead carp can lay over 1 million eggs in one season. Nothing native was eating them in any serious numbers. No parasite, no disease, and for most of their first 3 decades here, no predator big enough or common enough to actually slow them down. By the 2000s, they'd spread through the Mississippi, Illinois, Missouri, and Ohio systems, and keeping them out of the Great Lakes had become one of the defining conservation fights of the era. For most of 20 years, the carp were winning it. What was actually at stake in the Great Lakes? It's worth pausing on why agencies were willing to spend hundreds of millions on barrier infrastructure alone. Because this was never just about one invasive fish in one river system. The Great Lakes support a commercial and recreational fishery worth billions of dollars a year, plus a tourism and charter fishing economy spread across 8 states and 2 countries. Silver and bighead carp can eat up to 20% of their body weight in plankton daily. The same plankton that everything else in that food web, walleye, yellow perch, lake whitefish, depends on. State agencies ran modeling in the 2000s projecting that an established carp population in Lake Michigan could meaningfully depress native fish stocks within a few decades, with knock-on effects for a fishery supporting tens of thousands of jobs. That's the backdrop for the Brandon Road Project's $858 million price tag. It's not an overreaction to a nuisance fish. It's an attempt to head off a genuinely large, likely permanent transformation of one of the biggest freshwater systems on the planet. Which is exactly what makes the quiet, unplanned progress happening downstream on the Illinois River so significant. If a self-sustaining native predator can do even part of the job an $858 million engineering project is meant to do at a fraction of the cost, and without waiting on congressional funding cycles, that changes how the rest of this fight gets planned and paid for. The numbers that weren't supposed to move. For years, the data only went one way. Asian carp biomass in the Illinois River climbed season after season, survey after survey. The Illinois Natural History Survey had been tracking fish populations there since 1957, one of the longest continuous freshwater monitoring efforts in the country. By 2003, electroshocking surveys were pulling in silver and bighead carp at 18.4 pounds per minute of sampling effort in some reaches. By 2007, carp made up an estimated 60 to 70% of total fish biomass in the worst hit sections, Up, up, up. That was the whole trend line. So when the 2017 and 2018 survey reports came back, showing something different in specific corridors, researchers didn't immediately believe it. Dr. James Lamer, a fisheries biologist with the Illinois Natural History Survey, had spent years staring at trend lines that never gave him anything good to report. When the 2018 numbers showed a statistically significant drop in catch-per-unit effort for bighead and silver carp across 3 monitored reaches of the lower Illinois, his first instinct was to blame the method. He reran it. The decline held. Not a crash, not a wipeout, a real, sustained, multi-season decline in exactly the number that had only ever gone up for over a decade. What made it stranger was the harvest data sitting right next to it. Commercial removal hadn't ramped up in those sections. The organized netting operations, which had already been pulling tens of thousands of pounds out of the river every year, hadn't scaled up nearly enough to explain what the surveys were now showing. The Asian Carp Regional Coordinating Committee's 2019 annual report noted the softening in parts of the Illinois system, but didn't explain it, because harvest didn't explain it, and the barriers didn't explain it either. Something was cutting juvenile survival in those corridors faster than any active management program had managed, and whatever it was, nobody in that report could name it yet. The predator that ate the invasion nobody planned for. Here's the detail that reframes everything before it. In 2019, researchers at Southern Illinois University Carbondale published a multi-year gut content study of alligator gar pulled from the Mississippi and Illinois systems. The lead researcher, Dr. Solomon David, one of the country's leading alligator gar biologists, had spent years arguing the species deserved a second look as a native ecosystem regulator. What his team found in the stomachs wasn't subtle. Asian carp turned up again and again across multiple fish, across multiple sites, not as an occasional snack, but as a consistent part of the diet for gar living in the same backwaters and floodplains where juvenile carp cluster during their first couple years of life. That matters for a reason commercial harvest could never touch. Adult Asian carp are hard to catch. A mature silver carp moving fast through open water isn't easy prey for most native fish. But a juvenile carp in its first year is a completely different animal, smaller, slower, and packed into exactly the shallow, weedy, slow-current backwaters where alligator gar have always ambushed prey. One adult gar, lying motionless in cover, the way the species has hunted for millions of years, can pick off juvenile carp all season without burning the energy an active chase would cost. Multiply that across a recovering gar population spread through connected backwater habitat, and you're not looking at scattered predation events anymore. You're looking at a steady, systemic cut into juvenile survival, hitting the exact life stage that decides whether a population grows, holds, or starts to shrink. The math is simple once you see it. Asian carp hit reproductive maturity in 2 to 3 years. If enough juveniles die off in those first 2 years, season after season, the adult population stops replacing itself fast enough to hold steady. Commercial harvest goes after adults, after the damage is already locked in. Alligator gar goes after the pipeline before it ever delivers. There's a bigger ecological point buried in here too. Alligator gar are what biologists call an ambush apex predator. Armored, diamond-shaped scales, a long snout lined with a double row of needle teeth, and a body plan that's barely changed in tens of millions of years, which is why people call them living fossils. That design is built for exactly the habitat juvenile carp love: slow, weedy, low-visibility backwater, where a predator that doesn't move has every advantage over a school of small fish out foraging. Native fish in the Mississippi Basin evolved alongside a predator like this for millions of years. Asian carp didn't. They grew up in Asian river systems with a totally different set of predators, so nothing in their evolution ever selected for the specific tricks that would help a juvenile spot and dodge an ambush hunter like this one. In evolutionary terms, Alligator Gar walked in with a head start. No barrier or harvest quota could ever match. Millions of years of specialization against exactly this kind of prey. Sitting dormant in a fish Illinois had almost wiped out of its own rivers by the 1970s, then brought back for reasons that had nothing to do with an invasion that hadn't even started yet. The stocking program that was never meant to fight carp. Back in 2004, the Illinois Department of Natural Resources made a quiet call that had nothing to do with Asian carp at all. The agency launched a native species restoration program for Alligator Gar, a fish that had all but disappeared from Illinois waters by the 1970s, overhunted, cut off by habitat loss, and written off by most anglers as a nuisance rather than a keystone predator. The whole program was framed around biodiversity, bringing back a fish that belonged in those rivers before people wiped it out. Nothing more. Nobody in that planning room was thinking about invasive species because, at that point, Asian carp weren't yet the dominant story on the Illinois River. The early numbers were modest. A few hundred juvenile gar released into carefully picked backwater habitat along the river and its floodplain lakes. Small, hatchery-raised fish, facing plenty of pressure in year one. Managers expected a good chunk not to make it to adulthood, and that was already baked into the plan. Missouri started its own program in 2008. Arkansas expanded an existing GAR management effort around the same time. Tennessee followed shortly after. Each state ran its program on its own, answering to different agencies with different goals, and none of them were coordinating with anyone working on Asian carp. They weren't supposed to. That separation is exactly why the effect had almost 15 years to build before anyone connected the dots. Alligator gar don't grow up fast. Fish stocked in 2004 and 2008 needed 7 to 10 years before they were big enough to reliably take carp-sized prey. So the predation pressure those fish could generate didn't start showing up in the data until somewhere around 2014 to 2016, right when Dr. Lamer's long-term trend lines, the ones that had only ever pointed one direction for his entire career, started doing something new. In 2022, researchers at the Columbia Environmental Research Center ran a retrospective, lining up gar stocking records against carp population data across overlapping stretches of river. The correlation between years since stocking and measurable carp decline held up well enough across independent data sets that it demanded an actual explanation. The biodiversity program had been running a carp suppression program the whole time. It just didn't know it yet. The window that's closing, and math that doesn't care about our timelines. Here's the problem every freshwater biologist on this river is sitting with right now. Alligator gar live a long time. Individuals have been documented past 95 years old, confirmed through bone and scale aging by Texas parks and wildlife researchers. That longevity is part of what makes them such effective long-term regulators. But it's also exactly what makes the current race so tight. Hatchery-stocked juveniles need 7 to 10 years, minimum, before they're big enough to matter. That means gar stock today won't generate real predation pressure until sometime in the early 2030s. Self-sustaining wild populations, gar actually breeding on their own without more human help, need even longer to establish. Meanwhile, the electric barriers on the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, the main thing keeping the established carp population out of Lake Michigan, were only ever built as a stopgap. The Army Corps of Engineers' own 2022 Brandon Road Feasibility Report admits the existing barriers were never meant to hold indefinitely. The proposed Brandon Road upgrade, engineered water jets, acoustic deterrents, bubble barriers, has been sitting in planning and partial funding since 2017, with a projected cost of $858 million. As of 2023, it still didn't have full construction authorization. That gap between where Gar recovery is today and where it would need to be for river-wide suppression is not small. Dr. Caleb Hassler, an aquatic ecologist at the University of Winnipeg, published an assessment in 2022 estimating Gar would need to establish at meaningful density across hundreds of connected river miles before they'd produce suppression effects large enough to actually protect the Great Lakes. Current recovery efforts cover a fraction of that, and the timelines just don't match up. The biology moves in decades, the infrastructure moves in budget cycles and congressional votes. Asian carp move in spawning seasons. The rivers that recovered fastest had one thing in common nobody expected. While the fight over barriers and budgets dragged on at the federal level, something was happening at the state level that nobody's models had predicted. In 2021, Dr. Dwayne Chapman, a research fisheries biologist with the USGS's Columbia Environmental Research Center, published a comparison of carp population trends across several river systems at once, something earlier data sets hadn't been rich enough to support. What he found was specific, and it was striking. The sections with the steepest, most sustained drops in carp recruitment weren't the ones getting the heaviest commercial harvest. They weren't the ones closest to the electric barriers. They weren't even the ones with the most active management of any kind. They were the sections with the longest unbroken history of native apex predators, whether that came from successful gar stocking, a surviving remnant population, or connected habitat that had quietly held on to some large predatory fish through decades of broader decline. The pattern showed up across the Illinois system in parts of the upper Mississippi and in sections of the Ohio River drainage, where remnant gar populations had survived in backwaters that most monitoring programs had never really looked at. One of those remnant populations turned up in Kentucky's Lower Green River in 2019, found by a Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife crew doing a routine electroshocking survey. They weren't out looking for alligator gar. The species hadn't been recorded in that drainage in modern records. When one came up in the net, the lead biologist, Aaron Kindle, later told colleagues he wasn't even sure what he was looking at, because nothing in his experience had prepared him to find one there. When the team checked carp data for that same stretch, juvenile recruitment was noticeably lower than in comparable nearby sections without confirmed gar. One overlooked population, sitting there for years, already suppressing recruitment in its own patch of river, without a single management plan telling it to. What that Kentucky find really showed was something the stocking data had hinted at, but never quite proven. Alligator gar don't need big numbers to start making a difference. A handful of large, established fish spread across the right habitat can suppress recruitment enough to show up in survey data, years before anyone thinks to go looking for why. The genetic evidence that proved the shift was real. For a while, skeptics had a fair point. Maybe the apparent decline in parts of the Illinois and Mississippi systems was just carp moving somewhere else, not an actual population drop. Fish move. A decline in one stretch doesn't prove much on its own. Then the genetics came in. In 2023, researchers working with the USGS's Environmental DNA program, eDNA for short, started comparing water column DNA concentrations from fixed Illinois river sampling stations against archived samples going back more than a decade. Some of those stations have been running since 2009, filtering water and analyzing it for trace genetic material fish shed through mucus, waste, and scales. eDNA doesn't need you to catch anything. It reads presence and relative abundance straight from the molecules, which makes it a lot harder to write off as bad luck with a net. The multi-year comparison turned up something hard to argue with. Between 2015 and 2022, silver carp eDNA signals dropped significantly across several lower Illinois River sampling zones, especially in backwater-connected stretches where gar restoration had been most active. It wasn't uniform. Upstream zones still showed strong signals, but in specific corridors, the genetic load in the water measurably fell. That means fewer carp shedding DNA into the water, not just carp getting better at dodging nets. At the same time, eDNA sampling started picking up more genetic signal from large native predators, gar included, in stretches where the species hadn't shown up molecularly before. Dr. Wesley Daniel, a molecular ecologist working with the USGS program, put it plainly at a 2024 regional fisheries workshop. The shift is directional, not noise, and something is genuinely altering biomass structure in those corridors. The eDNA data also showed weaker juvenile carp signals during peak spawning runoff, which suggests recruitment itself, not just where the adults happen to be swimming, was taking the hit. That distinction is everything. Recruitment suppression is the only mechanism that produces durable, multi-year population change. Pulling out adults is a temporary fix. Failing to replace the next generation is structural. The molecular data confirmed what field surveys alone couldn't. This was biological, not logistical. The water itself was recording the shift. The trophic cascade nobody expected to see again. By 2024, something started showing up in Illinois River vegetation surveys that hadn't shown real recovery in almost 20 years. Submerged aquatic vegetation. The Long-Term Resource Monitoring Program, run jointly by the Army Corps and USGS, has tracked aquatic plant coverage since the early 1990s. When silver and bighead carp biomass surged in the 2000s, plant coverage in several backwater lakes fell off fast. Carp feed by filtering plankton and stirring up sediment, which clouds the water and blocks the light submerged plants need. By 2006, average light penetration in the worst-hit reaches had dropped below 20 centimeters during peak biomass years, and native plant beds declined right along with it. But between 2019 and 2023, survey teams started picking up small, statistically real increases in submerged vegetation in specific backwater complexes downstream of Havana, Illinois, the same areas where carp recruitment had weakened and gar presence had grown. Water clarity improved right alongside it. Secchi disk readings, the standard way of measuring turbidity by lowering a marked disk until it disappears from view, rose by measurable amounts during late summer sampling. Nothing dramatic, but consistent year after year. And consistency is exactly what tells you a real trend apart from noise. That's the early stage of what ecologists call a trophic cascade, a chain reaction moving through multiple levels of a food web from one change at the bottom. Fewer juvenile carp surviving means fewer adults reaching peak biomass. Fewer big filter feeders stirring sediment and eating plankton means slightly less turbidity. More light gets through, so submerged vegetation starts coming back. Plant beds stabilize sediment further and give invertebrates somewhere to live. Invertebrates feed the native fish that had struggled during peak carp years. In 2023, long-term resource monitoring data showed a modest uptick in young-of-year bluegill and largemouth bass catch rates in those same recovering backwaters. Not a full ecosystem turnaround, a direction. The kind of signal ecologists spend entire careers hoping to catch before an invasive species locks itself in for good. Dr. Michael Dreslick of the Illinois Natural History Survey put it carefully at a regional fisheries briefing. Nobody's talking about restoring 1950s conditions, but researchers are seeing localized resilience where invasive dominance used to look absolute. That caution matters because trophic cascades are genuinely hard to prove clean in an open river system, where rainfall, water temperature, farm runoff, and dredging schedules are all shifting at once and make it tough to pin a change on one cause. What makes the Illinois River case unusually convincing is how many independent threads point the same way. Field surveys showing decline, harvest data that couldn't explain it alone, gut content evidence pointing to the mechanism, eDNA confirming it wasn't just fish moving, and now vegetation and water clarity recovering in exactly the corridors the other 4 data sets already flagged. Any one of those on its own would just be suggestive. 5 lines of independent evidence lining up in the same place over the same years is about as strong a case as freshwater ecology tends to give you outside a fully controlled lab experiment. And that's really the distinction that matters here, the line between a temporary fix and a structural one. Commercial harvest pulls out biomass, and the population grows right back behind it. Predator-driven recruitment suppression changes the system at the level where population growth actually gets decided. For nearly 20 years, Asian carp looked like they'd permanently rewritten parts of the Illinois River food web. Now, in the corridors where apex predation has quietly come back, decades after a biodiversity program stocked a handful of hatchery fish for reasons that had nothing to do with carp, that food web is starting, unevenly and carefully, to respond. What happens over the next 10 years probably comes down to the same unforgiving math that's been running under this whole story since 2004. Can gar restoration scale fast enough, across enough connected river miles, before the infrastructure meant to hold the line at Lake Michigan runs out of road? There's a bigger lesson sitting inside this story, one that goes past carp and gar specifically. For decades, invasive species management in the U.S. has leaned almost entirely on human intervention, harvest quotas, physical barriers, chemical controls, engineered deterrents. Those tools matter, and the electric barrier system has almost certainly kept an established carp population out of Lake Michigan so far. But the Illinois River recovery hints at something conservation biologists have argued in theory for years and rarely gotten to watch play out this cleanly. Restoring a native predator, an ecosystem lost decades ago, can sometimes outperform the engineering built to compensate for its absence, simply because a living, self-sustaining population keeps doing the job every season, with no budget renewal, no construction permit, and nobody who has to remember to fund it again next year. That's also exactly why this story isn't a victory lap yet. A restored predator population isn't a finished project the way a completed barrier is. It needs connected habitat across hundreds of river miles. It needs another decade, at least, before today's stocked fish are big enough to matter. And it needs nothing else in the system, water quality, habitat loss, some new invasive competitor, to knock the recovery off track before it has time to fully take hold. The Illinois River didn't get its current, still partial answer from a bigger barrier or a bigger budget. It got it from a fish nobody was managing for this purpose at all, stocked for reasons that had nothing to do with Asian carp, that took the better part of 2 decades to start doing a job nobody assigned it. Whether that quiet recovery can outrun the clock on the rest of the system is the question every biologist on this river is watching now, one spawning season at a time.